Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers obstruction, qualified immunity, and reasonable suspicion, and is brought to us by Double App News' channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. On May 25th, 2022, the owner of the Double App News YouTube channel, who we will refer to as Mr. Double, was parked in his vehicle with his children in McKee, Kentucky, when Officer Weaver of the McKee Police Department responded to a call regarding a naked 12-year-old child running around in the area. Officer Weaver pulled his cruiser in front of Mr. Double's vehicle, exited the cruiser, and approached the driver's side window of Mr. Double's vehicle.
Hi, how are you?
Good. My name is Officer Weaver, McKee Police Department.
Okay, what's your badge number?
My badge number was 304. What's your name, please?
I don't answer questions. You ran my plate already.
I did not run your plate.
Okay, you can run the plate.
Yeah, I know I can run your plate because I have a legal right to do so.
Is this a traffic stop?
This is, I'm conducting an investigation.
Okay, so I don't need to answer your questions.
Well, if you hinder my investigation, you can be cited for that.
Okay.
Okay. That's the way that it is in Kentucky. When I went through the academy, that's the way that I was trained, is that if I'm conducting an investigation, I have the right to temporarily detain you.
Okay, what's your investigation?
My investigation was that there was an approximate 12-year-old juvenile running around this specific area naked. That's a very serious complaint.
Gotcha. Who made the complaint?
I received that call in public service, and I do not have to tell you that.
Okay, so call the complainant and figure out, where this child went. We have nothing to do with that.
Okay, all right. Do you have your identification on you?
No, sir. I don't need to identify myself.
You don't have to identify yourself?
No.
Okay.
You have reasonable articulate suspicion that I've committed a crime?
I do not think that you have committed a crime.
You have a body camera?
I have my body camera on.
Okay, very good.
This time, so
gotcha.
it's recording.
Do you suspect me of committing a crime?
I suspect. Since I don't have to interrogate you, and I don't have to read you your rights because we're just talking, you're not under arrest. I think that you are being very suspicious in the sense that you do not want to identify yourself. You're creating a certain amount of suspicion about yourself. You're not committing a crime.
Am I being detained right now?
You are being detained.
Okay.
I said you haven't committed a crime.
Okay.
I said, but I'm conducting an investigation.
Okay, so do your investigation.
May I have your name and your identification?
No, sir.
Okay. May I have the child's name?
No, those are my kids and they're minors.
So if I write you a ticket for hindering my investigation,
you'll be violating my civil rights and you'll be in civil litigation.
Okay. For doing what?
Am I being detained?
You're being detained because I'm conducting an investigation.
I'm requesting your supervisor now.
Officer Weaver informs Mr. Double that he has the right to detain him to conduct an investigation and that he is obstructing by refusing to answer his questions and identify himself and his children. According to Section 519.020 of the Kentucky Revised Statutes, quote, "A person is guilty of obstructing governmental operations when he intentionally obstructs, impairs, or hinders the performance of a governmental function by using or threatening to use violence, force, or physical interference. Therefore, Kentucky's obstruction statute requires some level of force or threat of force to sustain a conviction, and simply refusing to answer questions or obey commands from a police officer would not constitute obstruction under any circumstances." In the 2018 case of Haddon versus Wathen, the United States District Court in the Western District of Kentucky found that insufficient evidence of obstruction existed, explaining that, quote, "Though some testimony indicates that plaintiffs yelled at and criticized the officers, criticizing police conduct is quite different from using or threatening to use violence to obstruct an investigation. And in any event, because the First Amendment requires that police officers tolerate coarse criticism, plaintiffs' yelling and criticism of defendants' conduct cannot serve as the basis of their arrests." Here, Mr. Double did not even criticize Officer Weaver like the plaintiffs in the Haddon case did. Rather, he simply exercised his Fifth Amendment right not to answer questions. Officer Weaver also seems to misunderstand the reasonable suspicion standard, articulating that he has the authority to detain Mr. Double because he was conducting an investigation, even though he lacked reasonable suspicion that Mr. Double specifically had committed an offense. The Supreme Court's reasonable suspicion jurisprudence makes it clear that an officer must have particularized reasonable suspicion against the individual being detained, and cannot detain an individual based solely on reasonable suspicion that a crime has occurred or may be occurring in the area. For instance, in the 2000 case of Illinois versus Wardlow, the court held that, quote, "An individual's presence in an area of expected suspected criminal activity, standing alone, is not enough to support a reasonable, particularized suspicion that the person is committing a crime. Similarly, in the 1979 case of Brown versus Texas, the Supreme Court explained that in the absence of any basis for suspecting an individual of misconduct, the balance between the public interest and the individual's right to personal security and privacy, quote, tilts in favor of freedom from police interference, while recognizing that stopping and demanding identification from an individual without any specific basis for believing he is involved in criminal activity might advance the weighty social objective of prevention of crime. The court concluded that, quote, the guarantees of the Fourth Amendment do not allow it. When such a stop is not based on objective criteria, the risk of arbitrary and abusive police practices exceeds tolerable limits. In this situation, a court would likely conclude that Officer Weaver did not have particularized reasonable suspicion against Mr. Double, and therefore could not legally detain him.
If he is still around, I'll be more than glad to get him for you. I'll tell you what, I'll try to call him on the phone to help.
No, I don't want to speak on the phone. Why don't you tell dispatch to call the complainant, see if they can get a description or whatever the case may be to help you in your investigation.
Sir, I'm the police. Are you a police officer?
I don't answer questions.
Okay. I mean you no harm. I mean you no discomfort. And I am certainly not going to violate any of your civil rights. What I would like to know is if your children, however many you have in your vehicle, have been running around.
And I answered that when you first pulled up. I said I know nothing about that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to run your license plate.
You could do that. That's public information.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Like I said, I don't want to violate your rights. I have rights, you have rights.
Okay.
And I don't want to infringe upon those.
And if you violate my rights, you lose your qualified immunity.
Yeah, that would be fine if I violate your rights, but I'm not violating your rights. So I don't have anything to worry about because I don't intend to do that.
No problem. So I appreciate that.
Mr. Double claims that Officer Weaver will lose his qualified immunity if he violates his rights, and Officer Weaver insists that he does not intend to do so. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that shields police officers from civil rights lawsuits when they have not violated a so-called clearly established constitutional right. In the 2001 case of Saucier versus Katz, the Supreme Court held that when deciding if an officer is entitled to qualified immunity in a lawsuit, a court must first determine, quote, whether a constitutional right would have been violated on the facts alleged. If the court finds that the violation of a constitutional right was established, the court must then decide, quote, whether the right was clearly established. As the Supreme Court explained in the 2021 case of Rivas Villegas versus Cortez Luna, quote, a right is clearly established when it is sufficiently clear that every reasonable official would have understood that what he is doing violates that right. The use of a so-called reasonable official standard means that whether an officer knew they were violating a right or actually intended to do so is irrelevant to the qualified immunity analysis. Rather, the inquiry revolves around whether the officer should have known they were committing a violation. Additionally, in order to prove that a right is clearly established, a civil rights plaintiff must be able to point to a specific case that should have put the officer on notice that their particular conduct was unlawful. In the Rivas Villegas case, the Supreme Court clarified that although this, quote, does not require a case directly on point for a right to be clearly established, existing precedent must have placed the statutory or constitutional question beyond debate. The court also noted that, quote, this inquiry must be undertaken in light of the specific context of the case, not as a broad general proposition. Therefore, although Mr. Double is correct in his assertion that officers can lose qualified immunity by violating constitutional rights, it is important to note that officers who violate the Constitution do not automatically lose qualified immunity. Under the two-step analysis that the Supreme Court established in Saucier versus Katz, a court can find that an officer's conduct violated the Constitution, but ultimately grant qualified immunity because the right violated was not clearly established. The requirement that individuals pursuing civil rights lawsuits identify a specific case that puts the constitutionality of the officer's conduct beyond debate often derails civil rights lawsuits, even when the court finds that a constitutional violation occurred.
Sir, am I being detained?
Yes, you are still being detained. And since you asked for my supervisor, I'm going to try to get him down here.
But if you're detaining me, then yes, I'm requesting a supervisor. If I'm free to go, then I'm free to go.
You're being detained until I can finish my investigation.
I don't work for you guys. I don't need to help you in your investigation.
I came to you professionally. And you're refusing
You're gonna jam yourself up. I'm telling you.
Yep.
Unless you suspect me of committing a crime, I don't need to identify myself.
You've created a certain amount of suspicion and uneasiness, with me trying to conduct
So
my
how can I quell your suspicions?
You can identify yourself.
Okay.
There's a juvenile in your car that I can plainly see. That's plain view.
Okay.
Okay. I know that I got a call about a juvenile running around naked.
Okay. Did
In
you
this area.
observe any of these children running around naked?
Well, I don't know how many children you have. May I see?
Yeah. Why not?
Officer Weaver claims that he has reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Double because he received a call about a naked juvenile running around in the area, and Mr. Double had a juvenile in the vehicle. As a concurring opinion noted in the 2010 Supreme Court of Kentucky case of Blue Movies, Inc. versus Louisville, quote, public nudity is criminalized under the Penal Code under the statutes prescribing indecent exposure. Section 510.148 of the Kentucky Revised Statutes states that, quote, a person is guilty of indecent exposure in the first degree when he intentionally exposes his genitals under circumstances in which he knows or should know that his conduct is likely to cause affront or alarm to a person under the age of 18 years. And Section 510.150 states that, quote, a person is guilty of indecent exposure in the second degree when he intentionally exposes his genitals under circumstances in which he knows or should know that his conduct is likely to cause affront or alarm to a person 18 years of age or older. Because Kentucky law puts no age limit on what a so-called public offense action, which Section 600.020 of the Revised Statutes defines as, quote, an action brought in the interest of a child who is accused of committing a public offense, which, if committed by an adult, would be a crime, can be brought against a child in the juvenile court. It is possible that the 12-year-old who was the subject of the call could be arrested for indecent exposure. However, a naked child could also raise concerns about the child's welfare, or even that sexual abuse was potentially occurring. That being said, it's important to note that even if Officer Weaver had reasonable suspicion to detain Mr. Double, Kentucky law would not authorize him to require Mr. Double to identify himself. As the Supreme Court of Kentucky held in the 2014 case of Kavanaugh versus Commonwealth, because, quote, the Commonwealth of Kentucky is not a stop and identify jurisdiction, an individual, quote, could not have been arrested and prosecuted for failure to provide identification. However, in reaching this conclusion, the court also determined that, quote, since an officer is constitutionally permitted to request identification, any failure to comply may still be considered along with other sufficient factors demonstrating reasonable suspicion. Here, even with Mr. Double's refusal to identify himself, it is likely that a court would determine that Officer Weaver did not have reasonable suspicion to detain him.
You can look in.
Just two in here. Is there any in the back seat?
No, sir.
In the very back?
That's
okay.
it.
Do you have any weapons in the car?
No, sir.
Okay.
And I didn't have to answer that either, but
right.
As a courtesy, I don't have any weapons.
Like I said, this is a give and take. I'm going to go speak with this other unit real quick,
gotcha.
Okay? Okay. So, I have spoke with Deputy Bobby Edwards of the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, and I conferred with him and asked him, you know, I don't want to violate your rights. I do not think at this time, okay, from what the sum of everything that I've gathered, I do not think that you've committed a crime. And at this time, after speaking with Deputy Edwards, I do not feel like that I have enough evidence or probable cause to make you or try to force you to identify yourself. Have a good day, and I apologize for your inconvenience. But I am going to be leaving, therefore I'm terminating my investigation. Okay?
Yeah. I need a CAD number. Can you write it down for me, please?
If dispatch has a CAD up and running at this time, I'll get that for you.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
After conferring with Deputy Sheriff Bobby Edwards from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, Officer Weaver informed Mr. Double that he was free to leave without identifying himself and provided Mr. Double with a computer-aided dispatch, or CAD, number for the call. It is unclear whether Mr. Double intends to take any further action against Officer Weaver or the McKee Police Department. Overall, Officer Weaver gets a B for maintaining a polite and professional demeanor throughout the encounter, demonstrating a willingness to learn from his mistakes, and immediately and sincerely apologizing to Mr. Double for detaining him. While this grade may seem generous, given the fundamental misunderstanding of reasonable suspicion that Officer Weaver demonstrated and his unconstitutional detention of Mr. Double, it is clear throughout the encounter that Officer Weaver had either received inadequate and incorrect training or simply misunderstood the complicated legal concepts he was taught. Although this in no way excuses ignorance on the part of an officer of the law, Officer Weaver was willing to call for backup and take correction from a more experienced officer without a trace of complaint complaint and pushback, and openly apologized for his mistake. Officer Weaver seems to sincerely desire to serve the community while respecting constitutional rights, and I would encourage him to devote some time to learning the law and understanding the scope and limits of his authority. Mr. Double gets an A+ for remaining respectful and level-headed throughout his interaction with Officer Weaver, understanding and standing up for his constitutional rights, and requesting a supervisor to resolve the disagreement. Mr. Double has clearly educated himself on important legal concepts such as reasonable suspicion, the Fifth Amendment, and qualified immunity, and he unwaveringly defended his rights without becoming combative or attempting to provoke Officer Weaver. I commend Mr. Double for his ability to maintain a calm and polite demeanor under stressful circumstances and to refrain from unnecessarily escalating the situation. And by standing up to Officer Weaver and refusing to surrender his rights, he forced Officer Weaver into a situation where another officer corrected his misunderstanding of the reasonable suspicion standard. Ultimately, this interaction helped Officer Weaver become a better police officer and potentially prevented him from violating the rights of other citizens in the future. And Mr. Double should be proud that his efforts led to this improvement. I would encourage all citizens to learn from Mr. Double's example. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out my second channel for even more police interaction content.